they were able to get up to the Marines at the screening at the entry point of the base. There's a failure somewhere. It was a failure by, the Taliban operate with varying degrees of competence. Some of those guys are very scrupulously good. Some of them are not.
A photo from this week reveals just how dense the checkpoints can be. Dozens of service members within arm's length of those trying to get in.
This is close-up work. The breath of the person you are searching is upon you.
The president vowing to punish ISIS in Afghanistan, the group behind the attack.
We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay.
ISIS-K is made up of disaffected Taliban and foreign fighters, but they're the sworn enemy of the Taliban. Even so, hundreds of them escaped from prison as the Taliban released their own fighters during the rapid takeover of the country. In Washington, criticism mounting on the Biden administration for its handling of the evacuation, amid reports that American identities were shared with the Taliban in an effort to expedite their evacuation from the country. Leading Republicans now demanding answers, but the State Department denying it's been done in a way that exposes anyone to additional risk. But as the backlash intensifies, the airlift goes on. Officials reporting just over 4,000 evacuated from the country in the past 12 hours, the lowest figure in a week. The State Department saying they're working another 500 Americans who still want to leave.
We will be able to fly out evacuees right up until the last moment. That's going to be the goal.
Today in Afghanistan, the U.S. striking back, delivering on the promise of retaliation for a suicide bombing at Kabul airport 48 hours earlier. That left at least 169 dead, according to the Associated Press, including 13 U.S. servicemen. The target, an ISIS-K fighter believed to be involved in planning future terror attacks, according to 2 U.S. defense officials. He was riding in a vehicle in the Nangarhar province in eastern Afghanistan, once an ISIS stronghold. The weapon of choice, an NQ-9 Reaper drone. A CENTCOM spokesman said the target is believed to have been killed with no known civilian casualties. But U.S. intelligence agencies fear that ISIS-K may strike again. The U.S. Embassy in Kabul again yesterday, warning U.S. citizens to avoid traveling to the airport and to avoid airport gates. Despite those warnings, evacuations are still racing ahead. There are still Americans in Kabul desperate to get out before the U.S. deadline to finally leave Afghanistan on Tuesday.
And next tonight, to a major threat brewing in the Gulf of Mexico, Hurricane Ida could make landfall in Louisiana as a major hurricane as soon as Sunday. So let's bring in our senior meteorologist, Rob Marciano. Rob, time this out for us.
Well, Juju, it's rapidly approaching the coastline. This thing has really only been on a radar for a few days, and it's already a hurricane lashing into western Cuba. Let's take a look at it. It's getting a little bit banged up with the land interaction there, but once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico, it's all systems go. This thing is likely going to rapidly intensify. That's the warning out of the National Hurricane Center. That's what our computer models are saying. So many of them are not only saying it's going to rapidly intensify, but take this track, which brings it to the coastline of southeast Louisiana Sunday afternoon as a Category 4 storm with 140-mile-per-hour winds. Of course, hurricane warnings have been posted from just west of Lafayette to the Mississippi-Louisiana border. And this is going to have, when you're talking about Cat 4, you're talking about big-time winds that will be damaging winds. We saw that with Hurricane Laura in southwest Louisiana last year. And we're also dealing with a big-time surge, 10 to 15 feet in that area. And if you're outside the levee system, I mean, they're telling people to evacuate right now. Inside the levee system, you'll be tested with that sort of surge, and also going to be tested with the amount of rainfall coming in with this. 10 to 20 inches of rainfall near New Orleans, and that sort of rainfall is what the city can handle. This is going to come in potentially on the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, Juju. This is a much different track than Katrina. Actually, it's a much worse track for New Orleans, theoretically. So we're just going to have to see what happens. I know they're rushing to prepare for this as it quickly comes to the coast.
And that's ironic. Everybody has Katrina front of mind as this storm barrels down. But what has you most concerned as you eye this particular storm track?
Well, for one thing, we've all rightfully been distracted with the other headlines in the news. So this hasn't been on the radar of the public really for as long as a lot of hurricanes are, and it's quickly moving to the coast, and it's going to rapidly intensify. It's one of these things that's been a Cat 3, Cat 4 for days. So I'm not sure everybody is aware. I'm not sure everybody's ready to get out, and I hope that they will be able to get out if they're told to do that tomorrow. So that's concern number one. Concern number two is when you're talking about a Cat 4, I saw it in Lake Charles last year. Some of the infrastructure and buildings in this part of Louisiana cannot withstand 140, 150 mile per hour winds, and it looks like that's what's going to happen. So we're talking about widespread damage as if a large tornado would be coming through. I want to show you this one graphic which gives you an idea of how goosed the water temperatures are. 2 to 3 to 4 degrees above average in this part of the Gulf of Mexico, and that is just fuel for the fire. Obviously, climate change in this case is amplifying this storm, and that's a bit of a frightening scenario for southeast Louisiana, Juju.
It's been 58 years since Martin Luther King led the historic March on Washington. And this weekend, thousands are expected to attend marches across the country, including in our nation's capital, to demand more action to expand voting rights. And for more on this, I'm joined by NAACP President Derek Johnson, whose organization, you may know, recently launched a national campaign to combat voter suppression. Thanks so much for joining us, Derek.
Thank you.
We know you wrote an op-ed in USA Today earlier this week emphasizing that voting rights should not be a partisan issue, and yet the reality is it very much is. The House recently passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act this week along party lines, but it faces an uphill climb in the Senate. Are the numbers just not there to get these bills to President Biden's desk?
Well, we'll need 50 members of the Senate to support protection of our voting rights. We should not allow a procedural rule that was used by segregationists to impede our democracy. And that's what we're up against now. With NAACP, we're saying that there are 50 senators in the United States Senate to pass this legislation. It's not about partisanship. It is about our democracy.
And yet, given that Democrats are struggling to find a path forward on enough votes in the Senate on legislation, what's the end goal for the protests this weekend? What's the message?
Well, it is continue the heightened urgency to make sure that this is a priority. If members of the Senate can come together and pass a $3+ trillion package, surely they can pass legislation to protect the right to vote. This is not about one community. This is about our democracy. We're looking at the collapse of that took place in Afghanistan. We send young people abroad to fight for this democracy. Surely we can pass legislation to protect it here on our home front.
You're well aware, Derek, that while President Biden has previously called the pair of voting rights bills in Congress a national imperative, he hasn't seemed to make it a big administration priority, with issues like infrastructure, as you mentioned, and Afghanistan dominating the White House's time right now. Do you believe that the president has done enough on this issue, or is there a lack of political will or urgency from this administration?
But for us, we're looking at this one body at a time. The houses have done their job. Now it's for the Senate to do their job. And once the Senate do their job, we're looking for the president to sign this legislation. So we're really focused on the outcome, not the words, not the statements of support, but an outcome to ensure all Americans can go to the polls, cast an effective ballot, and that we do away with political gerrymandering, which is so important to ensure that our voices can be heard across this country and have a true representative democracy.
And so, speaking of words, have you had any recent conversations with President Biden or his team on efforts on voting rights? And if so, what's the message?
Well, my message has been consistent. We are in ongoing communication with both the leader of the Senate, the administration, and our message is very clear. Pass this legislation. There are no other options. The sense of urgency needs to be there, and we're going to keep pushing. We will have people on the ground, and while they're on recess, we'll have people in D.C. when they come back in September, because there is nothing more vital in this moment than ensuring that all Americans can exercise their right to vote.
One of the details that stands out in your op-ed is the number of bills that have been introduced by state legislatures making voting rights in this country more difficult. So far, you pointed to at least 17 Republican-led state legislatures passing voting restrictions in recent months. Given the pace at which Republicans are moving on these bills, are Democrats running out of time to address this before the 2022 midterms?
Well, it's unfortunate that elected officials are trying to select their voters. In a democracy, voters select those who represent them, not the other way around. And we are pressing a sense of urgency of members of Congress to do their job. This is not a partisan issue. This is an issue to ensure that we have elections that are fair, that are transparent, that are inclusive, so all legitimate citizens can fully participate in the electoral process. And that's all we're asking for. This is not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. This is an issue about America. It's a moral obligation to protect our Constitution.
And I want to get your reaction to another question brewing in the nation's capital today in the headlines. The Supreme Court ruling to suspend the CDC's nationwide eviction moratorium. Congressman Cori Bush, who led a protest that successfully led to the administration taking action to extend that moratorium, said in a statement today that the Black and brown communities, and especially Black women, will bear the brunt of this decision. Your reaction?
You know, Congresswoman Cori Bush is speaking from a personal experience. It is unfortunate in the midst of a current homelessness crisis that we are witnessing in this country, something that's been building up for several years, is going to be compounded by individuals being evicted. We must have a permanent solution to the ability of individuals to be in housing. That's important. When you go to Los Angeles and you see the level of homelessness, you go to Seattle, Washington, or you name the metropolitan area, you see the cross-section of loss of opportunity, the lack of job opportunity, the need for mental health support, and young children who are living in cars and in tents. It is a national disgrace. We must address the issue of homelessness. We must address the housing crisis as it has confronted this nation for several years now.
Derek Johnson, president of the NAACP, thank you so much for your time.
Mina sengabambelela kwesikamama isithembiso. Bengicela ungangibuza ukuthi kanjani ngoba wena kawuyazi impilo engiyiphilayo.
Kodwa ngilala nje.
Yini lapha? Ngifuna emzini wami. Uyabazi nomzima bokube intandane.
Ngisacela ubaba uNkulunkulu.
Wow.
Aseqede lesi sifuba sengiphethe. Uphendule ngicela.
KZN.
Lesi sithi ngicela ukuthi.
Ngithathe lo nayo wena. Letha la.
Kunzima ukuba intandane.
Unyoko base wangena egodini. Ingafuni ukumbona.
Abantu abangibona inkinga nabantu abanye. Izinto kahle.
Uyabazi ubuhlungu bokuvuka kusempondo zankomo uyozama ukuye ngasethunjini ubuye ulambathi. Uyabazi ubuhlungu bokushingana kweni khulela ukufa kanti nalapho uhamba uhambo likamabuyazi. Kunzima ukuba intandane.
Khalisani ngoba sibona. Akubona nje.
Oh Inhliziyo yami ukuphila kwami ithemba lami uma ndihleli baby ngicinga ngawe njalo uthando lwakho lwandishintsha langenza indoda namasekhaya ndibatshelile ngawe baby ndihlala nawe ndiphile nawe impilo yami yonke uthando lwami ngolwakho inhliziyo yami ngeyakho angisoze ngasuka kuwe baby isithando sami njalo hlala nami phila nami impilo yonke ngiyakuthanda kuze kube sekuphele
kabishi bekuvele kucatshwana bekuyindlovu kayiphikisa umama limkhanda ngebhathu lishubisa mase kufike ekhaya emva kwenyanga entathu jitsa wadala wajula wacabanga kumele enzeni phela yikho into ezoyizela kuye emehlele empedeni wafuka wayosebenza nezinto zaqala.
Hey Kaola, this is your boy dude, Mr. Quick Chillers himself. This coming Friday, I'm releasing a music video titled Lena Lane, talking about the journey of my life through music and everything in life. The track is featured Stella Kowani. Stay tuned. Hey Kaola, I love you.
Then ungangibuza ukuthi ngiphumaphi zengishizilile then ungangibuza ukuthi ngiphumaphi zengishizilile
sure ha leli khanse likhule kanzima oledile ngaspani itama noma belisipana kodwa hlezi itakotshwana ngacabanga nanokuthi ekhaya ingane sibanjwe indlala phela lona belisicabangela lona nabangani belisithandana nesiketi lidlalisa komamncane kodwa ekhama lifica ikabishi bekuvele kucatshwana bekuyindlovu kayiphikisa umama limkhanda ngebhathu lishubisa mase kufike ekhaya emva kwenyanga entathu jitsa wadala wajula wacabanga kumele enzeni phela yikho into ezoyizela kuye emehlele empedeni wafuka wayosebenza.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. After increasing for nearly 2 months, the global number of COVID-19 cases and deaths was stable last week. But it's stable at a very high level, more than 4.5 million cases and 68,000 deaths. However, the situation is very different from region to region, country to country, province to province, and town to town. Some regions and countries continue to see steep increases in cases and deaths, while others are declining. As long as this virus is circulating anywhere, it's a threat everywhere. There are no shortcuts. WHO continues to recommend a comprehensive, risk-based approach of proven public health and social measures in combination with equitable vaccination.
Israel's nationwide vaccination campaign was hailed as a success story that helped to drastically reduce infections in the country. But the latest Delta variant outbreak has led to an increase in cases, and many experts believe that the crisis is far from over. Israel was one of the first countries to vaccinate a majority of its population in a very small amount of time. By June, the mandatory mask requirement was completely dropped, and the only COVID curbs that remained were regarding international travel. Now, the rate of infection has again risen to 5.4%, and the Bennett government has said that it will take necessary measures to avoid further lockdowns. As Israel's COVID wave continues to worsen, the country's top COVID official admits that authorities mishandled the crisis with regard to inoculating the unvaccinated. During an interview, Israel's coronavirus czar, Professor Salman Zarqa, said that COVID-19 is here and it will stay, and we may have to wear a mask for many months. While acknowledging the government's mistake, Zarqa said that officials were pressurized to formulate policies without sufficient data. Israel has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, with 78% of the adult population fully vaccinated. Despite this, the country is currently witnessing a significant spike in cases. Our correspondent Jody Cohen has sent us more details in this next report from Jerusalem. Listen in.
Israel was an early success story in the COVID pandemic, effectively becoming the testing laboratory for Pfizer's vaccine and sharing its medical data with the world. However, coronavirus SAR Professor Salman Zarka now says Israel dropped the ball and should have done more to encourage further vaccination while COVID cases were low. Suggesting Israel won the battle but the war is still here, he said preparations are needed for a possible fifth wave. With kids going back to school next week and the Jewish New Year festivities approaching, the government is busy looking at what more it can do to limit the spread of the Delta variant. This is Jody Cohen from Renana, Israel for WION World is One.
WION World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.
Good evening. The reality of our battle with COVID hit home today as the state recorded the worst case numbers of the pandemic so far. 1,035 new infections. It's placing immense pressure on our ambulance system and pushing our paramedics to their limits.
Ali Naiman, 70 years old, died from COVID at 4:30 this morning. Left behind 14 children and 53 grandchildren. Ali from Yaguna didn't know how he got the virus, and he had one shot of a vaccine. His devastated daughter Amy now has a message: take COVID seriously, stay home and get vaccinated. In Milson's Point this morning, tributes for Jimmy. Jim Sard was a fixture of the train station, working as a cobbler and key cutter for nearly 60 years. Another casualty of the state's COVID crisis.
To have any loved one pass away at any time is obviously challenging, but in this COVID situation, I think many of us are feeling it even more.
1,035 new COVID cases in the past 24 hours, another all-time high. And to 8 p.m, 2 more people who've lost their lives. A woman in her 70s died at Nepean Hospital where she caught the virus. A woman in her 80s from Western Sydney has also died. In a war with a virus, our paramedics are the firing line.
Our workforce is going from job to job to job without a break. They are virtually wrapped in plastic. They are doing their job without expecting anything in return.
Just yesterday, called to help 450 patients with COVID or suspected COVID.
Over the last 3 days, New South Wales Ambulance has experienced call demand to 000, equivalent of our busiest New Year's Eve.
Officials found low confidence it was an animal infection that started COVID and a moderate confidence that it was a lab incident. I assume you've read this report. If that's the case, should China be held more responsible for this? And how do we move forward?
Well, let me tell you what I think, and then I'll tell you what I know. What I think is that the report was pretty unsatisfying because the intelligence community, even though the president asked them to, was really not able to come up with a definitive answer as to whether or not this was natural transmission from animal to human or whether there was a lab leak. Now, this is something that I've been reading about for a very long time in classified environments, and the intelligence community is a little bit at odds with itself on that. Now, why is that? And here's where you absolutely do hold the Chinese accountable. The reason for that is the Chinese, from moment one, 18 months ago, have not been open and honest with the world or with the United States with the data and the information that we would need to form some kind of a judgment.
Well, I appreciate all of your insights, Connecticut Democratic Congressman Jim Hines. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Tonight, with an expected major hurricane taking aim, Louisiana hospitals already dealing with a surge of COVID-19 patients are now preparing to shelter in place. Dr. Jeffrey Elder telling me this is a worst-case scenario.
This is a large hurricane. We have to be ready for that. We know we're going to have higher census because of the COVID patients in the hospital, and so we're preparing for both simultaneously.
Louisiana has one of the highest COVID-19 case rates per capita in the country. The storm already forcing some testing and vaccine sites to shut down early. As residents race to prepare and evacuations begin, Ida is forecast to make landfall 16 years to the day since Hurricane Katrina in 2005.
Okay, good.
We met Dr. Tanner Libsack, still in his scrubs from treating COVID patients, now preparing to board up his home.
Jumping right into this has been kind of a bit of a mess, but we're doing the best we can.
And Victor Akenda joins us now. Victor, Hurricane Katrina devastated the city, as we all know, 16 years ago, and hospitals had a lot of major difficulties at the time. How are they preparing now, differently perhaps?
Juju, one of the doctors that we spoke with explained how hospitals here have been hardened since Hurricane Katrina to bear the brunt of a storm. They've fixed issues like water, sewage, electricity, and he explained how in the event where they have to be cut off from the rest of the world for some time, they're ready. Juju?
Tonight, the toll of the pandemic growing by the day. More than 1,200 deaths reported in just 24 hours, the highest single-day total since early March.
It's tough for the ones who have been through it already to see these people struggle and die.
In just the last month, the virus spreading like wildfire. All 50 states now reporting high community transmission. In Oregon, hospitalizations up nearly tenfold in the last 6 weeks.
With fewer staff and fewer beds, we're struggling to meet patients' needs.
Hospitalizations in Kentucky breaking records. The governor frustrated.
I'm going to admit up front today, a little emotional and a little raw.
But in Florida tonight, a major legal victory for 10 school districts defying Governor Ron DeSantis' ban on mask mandates. A judge ruling the governor overstepped his authority, DeSantis vowing to appeal. This as the country reaches a new milestone. 50% of kids 12 to 17 years old have now had their first vaccine dose. And overall, more than 1 million doses administered in the last day, the most in 8 weeks. In Central Florida, Lisa Stedman now wants the shot. She and her husband were holding off when they both got COVID. Lisa coming home from the hospital this week, only to find her husband had passed away from COVID-related complications.
And remember, you are not promised tomorrow, so you better make sure you tell your loved ones you love them.
And Whit joins us now with the Director of National Intelligence today releasing that unclassified assessment on the origins of COVID-19. Tell us about it.
Juju, this report indicates that the intelligence community is divided over the findings. 4 agencies assessing with low confidence that the COVID-19 virus spread to humans naturally from an infected animal. Another agency assessing with moderate confidence that it came from a lab leak or lab incident of some kind. However, there is more agreement that the virus was not created as a biological weapon. Still, more information is needed from China. And tonight, President Biden is promising that efforts to understand the origins of this pandemic will not rest.